Looking through the zero RB universe, looking at the backfields around the league that may be the key pieces for the fantasy football playoffs. That's what we're going to talk about today on RotoViz Overtime as we approach NFL Week 14. We have Thursday Night Football coming up, Shawn. I'm very excited about this for people listening to it. If you're hearing it on Friday, that will mean you already know how that went. I'm hoping the Packers can spring an upset against the Lions. Should be a pretty fun one. Shawn, let's hope for a shootout and see how things kick off. Myself and Shawn in the main event championship final this week. We have a Jahmyr Gibbs team. So hopefully that was a fun one for people to watch. We're going to go through some of the other teams here, some of the other key players, and have a look around from that perspective. Shawn, week 14, an exciting time, fantasy playoffs right here. Or if you're playing in a league like our dynasty leagues where it is still a few weeks away, it's kind of, you need to be getting those wins, getting those points to advance through. Excited for week 14?
Yeah, we're in the finals. That's the key thing there. Colm, as I was watching week 13, I was flashing back to the show we did a few weeks ago, evaluating our draft. And we felt like the two key mistakes were passing on Jerry Jeudy and passing on Bucky Irving. Colm, I don't know if you noticed, but they were the running back one and the wide receiver one this past week. We have the decision between, well, I guess we don't really have a decision. You have Juwan Jennings ranked ahead of Jordan Addison. I have Jordan Addison as our easy wide receiver starter. The other two guys we could fit in there would be Xavier Worthy, who has left more on the table this year than maybe any other wide receiver in NFL history. Patrick Mahomes has not been particularly accurate on those deep throws. And Jalen Waddle, who almost certainly is one of the most disappointing healthy third-round picks in fantasy football history. Colm, if we simply had the person we passed on in the double-digit rounds instead of our third-round pick, we would be golden. But I'm fired up for this. Addison, Jennings, those guys are going to get it done along with our trio of superstar tight ends bringing it home for us. Monday Night Football, Colm, was crazy. That happened
Wild.
After we recorded. We actually had a little bit of a clip or a segment at the end of the second show where I was lamenting getting chopped, wishing the rest of the OT community still alive in our Guillotine 2 league. Good luck. I needed 32 points from Jerry Jeudy. Colm, I didn't just pass the last place spot there, but passed several teams. Jerry Jeudy's scoring some points right now. We'll see if that continues into his second matchup with the Pittsburgh Steelers. We're going to look a little bit more deeply at running backs today. Zero RB Universe obviously is out. Kevin did a great job for you early in the week with waivers, focusing on Isaac Guerendo. He is the very popular play this week, with the 49ers having to put both Christian McCaffrey and Jordan Mason on IR. Colm, I didn't cover Guerendo or really the other, I think, tricky running back spot or interesting running back spot, a potential high upside team, squad, what have you, in the write-up. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit more today. As we're recording, we don't yet know exactly where Breece Hall is going to be Thursday and Friday for practice, but certainly he's got some things that aren't quite right. The Jets are going nowhere. Braelon Allen has been decent, but one of the elements that makes it a little bit tricky, and Braelon Allen is actually on our team. Now, there probably isn't a way for us to get him into the lineup because we're flexing two tight ends. However, you are excited to have as much depth as possible. Now, we, like many OT listeners, are going to have plenty of Breece Hall, so there'll be other places where that hurts us. But as you're looking at this, and when we think about the Jets' backfield, it isn't just Braelon Allen. The problem that you have if they would hold Breece Hall out is that there's a real possibility for Isaiah Davis to be the back who gets the high value touches there. In this most recent game, for example, Davis caught the 3 passes and scores a receiving touchdown. How are you looking at these two players and this Jets team? You had asked me before we started recording, am I worried about the Jets benching people? I guess I'm not necessarily worried about them just purely giving people tryouts. I think that everybody in this organization is probably going to be fired, but I think being uncompetitive down the stretch not only guarantees that you get fired, but also makes it much more difficult to find new jobs next season. I mean, that's something else that you have to consider. It's not just whether or not you get fired, but if you are marketable at all after what you have done this year and you leave a really bad taste in everybody's mouth, the prospective employers, if you go out there and lose a bunch of games by 20, 30 points, we're still talking about a New York Jets team that's probably one of the more talented in the NFL, which is one of the reasons their 3-9 season is such an atrocity. Colm, looking at this backfield, would you feel comfortable playing Braelon Allen even if Breece Hall is out?
I think it'll really depend on your roster and how it looks. So you mentioned our situation. It's a Gibbs Chase Brown team. So that kind of takes a lot of those question marks out. But if we didn't have flex positions available and you're looking at who could go in there, I still think that I would be comfortable playing Braelon Allen. Obviously, Davis did come in last week, as you mentioned, had the 3 receptions on 3 targets, got the touchdown. But we could see things change very quickly in New York. I still think that it's Breece Hall and Braelon Allen well ahead of Davis as we move forward here. If we're looking at the season, he's had 4 receptions on 4 targets. So he's 100% completion percentage going his way. But we also seen what Braelon Allen did earlier in the season. But the Jets offense has been struggling all year long. So there's obviously the concerns that go along with that. But if it's a situation, Shawn, where we obviously hope Hall will be active, but if he's not, I do think if you're in those flex situations that I would still be starting Braelon Allen. I would be having concerns of if I had to rely on starting Davis because I just can't be confident that the volume will be there. If Hall was out, I would expect it to be Braelon Allen's backfield. Concerns from you on that side?
No, not necessarily. I think that what we saw from Allen in the preseason and the consistency with which they have deployed him in short yardage, you would expect there to be high value touches, if nothing else. Even in a game here where Davis does play a bit as a receiver, you have more routes for Allen. So it's 15 for Hall, 11 for Allen, 8 for Davis, according to the SIS numbers. A couple of those plays did result in targets for Allen as well. And they were pretty designed plays where he was going to be catching the swing pass and then hopefully running with it. So you have, arguably at this point, a decent floor for Allen, even in a game where Breece Hall plays, because right now he's not healthy enough in all likelihood to play a whole game. Both of these guys I think are interesting. If you are in a deep league where for whatever reason, you're still live despite running back issues. Well, the thing that is so interesting about adding to the running back position right now is that we've had so few injuries outside of what has happened with the 49ers that, no one essentially needs running back in the way that teams traditionally would have. Now, there are some specific situations where maybe you could have gone with a 0 RB team and hit so perfectly on the rest of your picks that you're still alive, and maybe you're a little bit softer at running back, or maybe you just do need some depth. One of the things I mention in the 0 RB universe from time to time is the fact that simply because running backs have stayed so ridiculously healthy by historical standards in 2024 doesn't mean that they will in the fantasy playoffs. You'd hate to be caught out because you didn't have anything really to go to. And Colm, that was one of the things that we were dealing with on our team this week, where we have, as you mentioned, Gibbs and Brown, but then not a lot behind that. Other than, as we mentioned, we do have Braelon Allen. We have been stashing Aldrick Estime. That looks like it almost certainly is going to come to nothing, but there's still a chance that things evolve, right? You think about how much different every week looks. 3 weeks from now, looking at week 17, you're playing for all the marbles. Maybe it becomes very obvious that the Broncos have finally made that move. But just having those two guys wouldn't necessarily be enough. Maybe neither of them is playable. And as a result of that, we did add Sincere McCormick in waivers yesterday as well, a player that Ben and I spent quite a bit of time on the Stealing Bananas episode looking at. If anybody is interested there, make sure you go and check it out. Colm, you feel comfortable with how we have approached the running back position and where we are now going into hopefully this 3-week sprint? Again, for anybody who doesn't know, we do still have to win this weekend in order to qualify.
Comfortable, Shawn, is like a phrase that can be open-ended in this situation. We have two very valuable starters in Gibbs and Chase Brown. If anything happens to either of them, I think we're in a little bit of trouble. The advantage that we have is with Braelon Allen, with Sincere McCormick, it seems like now with the Raiders is likely to get an opportunity there. They seem quite impressed with what they have seen to take him off the practice squad, to sign him to the roster. So that is a nice pickup as you head into this stage of the season. Estime, it looked like it was going to lead into his backfield, and then it hasn't at this present moment. This was a team that also did draft Javonte Williams, who has been cut from the roster. The one advantage that we have in this particular setup, Shawn, when it looks at the running back position, you mentioned flexing two tight ends. It's Bowers, McBride, Johnny Smith. The likelihood that we need to use a third running back is going to be very, very slim on this roster with the wide receivers. Nico Collins on a bye this week. He obviously automatically would slot back into the lineup. So I'm comfortable if we can keep those two starters healthy. If we win this week, we get ourselves into that sprint. Outside of that, we have some contingent upside with Allen. We kind of talked through that situation a little bit already. Estime, do they decide the thing with the Broncos is more than likely, I think they are going to make their way into the playoffs, not wild card spot. So they're coming off their bye next week. And with a team that's playoff bound, I think you're more likely to continue to try and go with the players that have got you there, which he has been part of that. But rather than just say, let's see what we have here with the rookie. But we haven't seen much from him over the course of the season in terms of like fantasy football points that you can put in. He had 53 yards against the Kansas City Chiefs, but the highest score this season for him is 5.5 points on the year. So it's going to be hard to plug him in with a lot of confidence unless that backfield is really shooken up post bye week. So the depth chart for us, Shawn, is the two guys I mentioned, then Allen, then McCormick. You mentioned the conversation you had with Ben on McCormick. Is there, again, I think this team's locked in, but if you were a team that didn't have Chase Brown, Jamar Gibbs, and the tight ends, is there situations that heading into this week and it being such a vital week that you would be willing to put McCormick or Allen into a flex situation?
You'd have to be awfully gutsy or awfully desperate, I think, to put them in now. These moves are a lot more about preparing for the future.
Not having waivers. No waivers in the playoff or in the sprint, obviously.
Right. And if you do still have a league where waivers are going to be open, it's a matter of maybe massaging your picks so that you don't lose a waiver priority. It's spending your money so that you still have a little bit of leverage. All of those types of things to not just put a guy on the watch list, but position yourself to actually get them if, worst comes to worst and you have to make that move. Similar to what we saw this week, Colm, with Isaac Guerendo. I mentioned that Kevin had the big write-up on him in this week's waiver article for RotoViz. Colm, Guerendo is interesting. He is someone that I have on the back of some best ball rosters because I really liked his profile simply from the perspective of this being a guy who probably was overly criticized for his collegiate profile. Now, anyone who checked out the RotoViz rookie guide knows that Guerendo was not hugely productive. He's not someone, despite the ridiculous size, speed, profile who runs like a big back. However, you dive into his collegiate peripherals, you see the ability to not only make some guys miss, but also function as a receiving back. I think that one of the things that we're going to get from Guerendo is more receiving upside than Jordan Mason provided. The big contrast, of course, is that Guerendo is not going to run into the line and then break 4 or 5 tackles and then break out the back of the line and run further 10 yards like Mason was doing. That type of player is pretty rare. What Mason was doing, kind of looking like, we talked about it in the 0 RB candidates countdown before the season, that Mason could be basically this year's Jaylen Warren. And not only has he been that, but he's been much better than Jaylen Warren himself. For Mason to have been everything that you could have possibly hoped in terms of all of the little breadcrumbs with him and what he'd done in the past, for those to all manifest and for him to come out and be this brawling, fantastic broken tackle, yards after contact guy was really cool, right? You got the perfect outcome for him other than the really unfortunate injuries. I know it's super heartbreaking for people who had Mason on rosters that when he was set to potentially get his opportunity again, that he also gets put on IR. Now, probably not as big a surprise as it might have been since he's been struggling with injuries over the last, really full second half of the season.
He had 6 really strong weeks to start the season, and then kind of had 2 weeks that were okay. But from the Dallas game onwards, he's been pretty banged up. And I think, we sometimes touch on when we talk about T. Higgins, but there was a lot of games like that for Mason managers in the second half of the season where you're like, he's active, so I'm putting him in there, and then it's like he's getting 1 carry, he's getting 6 carries, 2 carries. So that's obviously tough, but he obviously, when you think of the personal side, he's been dealing with a lot of injuries, and unfortunately injured reserve is the answer.
And you look at where the 49ers are now. Deebo Samuel has had a nightmare season that really matches up with the nightmare performance of Jalen Waddle. I mean, those two guys have been...
I actually think that Samuel might be a tougher pick. Obviously, we've had a couple of bigger games from Samuel early in the season, so it started off okay and you're not as concerned. But in recent weeks, it's been really bad. His attitude seems to have been, a cause of concern. We've mentioned that on the show a number of times. But if you look at, opening up targets, because Brandon Ayuk is out for the rest of the season for a considerable portion of time, like, we haven't had Christian McCaffrey for a lot of that time, which you kind of think this is going to open up the situation for Deebo to just crush, even based on volume and ability. What he can do out of the backfield, and we're talking there about Jordan Mason in the start of the season, but like, he has just not been a factor at all. He has 1 touchdown, or two total touchdowns, 1 rushing, 1 receiving. But the outlook of the season, if you knew that you were going to be missing Ayuk in this offense, you would think that he's just gonna absolutely crush. But Shawn, what's the opposite of crush?
He's gotten crushed, right? We look at Jordan Mason. You mentioned those first 6 weeks. One of the things that I was tracking for the articles was that he was actually number 6 in running back routes across that time period. The only players at the position who ran more routes were Breece Hall, Kyron Williams, Bijan Robinson, unfortunately Zach Moss, Jerome Ford. For those to be the guys, he ran 1 more route than Alvin Kamara. Now, Kamara drew 37 targets. Mason only 10. He was not involved as a receiver, even though he was running all those routes. And that way he's been very similar to Kyron Williams, who has run a crazy number of routes, never draws a target. That has been pretty devastating for his profile this season. I think that with what you described, with Ayuk out, with Deebo really struggling. Now, one of the things that I think is very likely to happen now is that Deebo is going to go back and he's going to be that McCaffrey-esque type of player, in part because, they have to be unbelievably frustrated with his ability to catch. The thing that you always hope for Deebo is that if Ayuk is out, they will use him on some deeper routes. And not that he's going to become that, but that it just opens up another area where he could potentially thrive. The weird element with him is that despite ridiculous yards after the catch metrics through his career, he has not graded out very well in other categories. And in 2024, the eyeball test would tell you that where he may have been overly criticized by some of the algorithms prior to this year, I mean, this year, if you want to give him zeros,
come back to the main. Yeah.
In those categories, can't get open, doesn't catch the ball. I mean, he cost them a game a couple weeks ago because he continued to let balls go directly through his hands and then to defensive backs. That creates an environment with the 49ers where George Kittle and Jawan Jennings should get a lot of targets down the stretch of the season. We'll see what Pearsall is able to do. One of the reasons that I think you can have maybe a tiny bit of skepticism even for Deebo is that Guerendo should draw some targets, whereas Mason was running empty routes. Now, it's not going to be a thing where Guerendo is Christian McCaffrey, but you can be somewhere in the middle there. And then Guerendo is the guy who, as we mentioned before, is not going to break the tackles, but if he gets a hole, he's going to be gone. Now, the other thing I want to note here, just before I even say it, is that he's also not going to be remotely like Saquon Barkley. But the ability to be gone if you have a hole is a big deal, right? One of the things I mentioned and mentioned again this week, I mean, Bucky Irving's evasion rate is twice as high as Saquon Barkley's. He's averaging more yards after contact than Barkley. What Barkley does is that when he has a hole, he scores long touchdowns.
He doesn't get caught.
Guerendo is not that type of player, but already this season, we've gotten several big plays from Guerendo, and you have that potential. You can see it when he gets through the line. So it's not something where you're thinking, okay, you look at his college stats, this is what he could be. You look at his combine, this is what he could be. He's already done it as an NFL player multiple times. I think you have to be enthusiastic about that. And if he can do that a little better than some of their other non-McCaffrey backs in terms of doing it in the receiving game, then maybe Deebo doesn't get such a huge workload out of the backfield as he has, again, in some campaigns. So that's something to look for. We don't know for sure. I think that, though, the combination of Guerendo and Deebo could make it tough for guys behind Guerendo to have a lot of value. We know Patrick Taylor was a trendy pickup as well. And then Colm, one of our old favorites, Israel Abanikanda, is now on the San Francisco 49ers.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that in terms of, like, obviously we talked a lot about Guerendo in the offseason. You mentioned some of his college points there. We have seen some of the big plays, but if we look back, against the Seahawks, he has a 76-yard rush, and then it's 10 for 99. So it's 9 for 23 from the other plays. Last week we get a 15-yard rush, but it's 4 for 19. Does get in the end zone on that 15-yard rush, which is obviously helpful. But it's, do the team stick with him if there's a lot of those carries that are not gathering the yards? Because if he can't break the tackles, the play obviously stops at that particular point. He also has just the 6 targets on the year, 5 receptions. So it'll be interesting to see if they do start to factor that in. Was it that he just wasn't a part of the way the depth chart set up? Was he somebody who just was a step down where he wasn't going to get on the field for those particular plays? The weird thing about Deebo, Shawn, when you mentioned the rush attempts, week 1 he had 8 rushes for 23 yards and a touchdown. On the season, he has 27 rush attempts. So he only has 19 rush attempts after week 1. He had none last week, none the week before, 1 the week before that. This is a player that, like, you talk about being like a utility player or a gadget. Everyone was talking a couple of seasons ago about, who's the next Deebo Samuel? We were talking about there's not going to be another Deebo Samuel because he's so unique. And my fear is that
now Deebo Samuel isn't Deebo Samuel.
Yeah, but my fear is that it's not Deebo Samuel isn't Deebo Samuel, because we give Kyle Shanahan all the credit in the world for what he can do as a play caller and scheming things up. If he's not trying to scheme up these plays for Deebo Samuel, it might be a case that he thinks that Deebo Samuel doesn't have that ability any longer. And obviously players can't phase out, but he's 28 years old. There should be some gas left in the tank, but he has dealt with some injuries over the last couple of seasons.
And
Shawn,
that's the other problem, Colm, is that in addition to questions about his ability to separate running routes and questions about his ability to catch the ball, are questions about his ability to stay healthy. And so that has been an eternal frustration for fantasy managers as well. Again, we like Deebo. Certainly the head coach suggested that, our criticism of him with the long snapper was not on him. All those things are positive. We want him to play well, but he's definitely moved into that same Jalen Waddle category where right now you've got to prove it if you're going to be that guy that you've been in the past.
The other one I was going to say is Abanikanda is in the backfield, obviously Patrick Taylor as well. When you have somebody who we have seen him have those big plays in the NFL in Guerendo, but we haven't seen him be used in that way consistently. Obviously we have two young running backs here, and then we have an older guy and Taylor. But with Abanikanda, the buzz last offseason about how things could look for him, but he was in a situation behind Breece Hall. Then they draft Braelon Allen this year for the Jets, and they cut him most recently. He just has 22 career carries, Shawn, for 70 yards, 7 receptions for 41 yards. Is a change of scenery into a different offense like this where he may really land on his feet? Is he somebody who you could see like, oh, we're looking here, fantasy playoffs, the sprint, trying to win $1 million? Is Abanikanda somebody who in like 2 weeks could be leading this backfield?
Yeah, I don't think there's any question. You think about some of the seasons in the past where you have the big games from a Jeff Wilson, from a Raheem Mostert. Mostert with the elite speed ended up being a big time player for them fairly late in his, not in his career exactly, but in that age trajectory that we normally see from NFL running backs. And then he took that obviously to the Miami Dolphins and had the big 2023 season. Abanikanda has some similarities to Guerendo, with the exception that he actually put up some big numbers in college. Now, when you look at the peripherals, Abanikanda is somewhat similar in that he also does not evade tackles. And I think that if you have a macho coaching staff like the New York Jets, then that ends up being a problem. It's been a little bit of a problem for Breece Hall, where that's not really what he does either, right? He's not somebody who's going to go out and run over people. Despite his size, he runs a little bit like a smaller back, where he's going to try to make the first guy miss and then explode to daylight. I don't know that Abanikanda can even necessarily do that. But if there is a hole, you're talking about someone with elite athleticism. The NFL has continued to evolve. We're getting a little bit more of the Jordan Mason style back in some of these Shanahan offenses. But you think about what has worked, at least in some specific cases in the past, where you're talking about, can we get the blocking to work in such a way that we open a lane out wide, and then does the back have the speed to take advantage of it, right? You're not looking to get a 3 and 4 yard gain from those plays. You're looking to take the pitch and be gone. A lot of the backs that they have added to the roster in past or in recent seasons don't really have that ability. Abanikanda does. I'm not saying that it will work. Opposing defenses have found some solutions to that type of play. This year's 49ers, even with Christian McCaffrey, were a team that in many cases has just simply not been that effective offensively. The thing that has been, I think, pretty shocking this year is that purely from a rushing perspective, the 49ers got worse when Jordan Mason was injured, and then they made that transition back to Christian McCaffrey. So it's in no way saying that McCaffrey isn't still awesome, or that he won't be in the future, or that you wouldn't prefer to have Christian McCaffrey. That receiving element is really the whole ball game. But yeah, we've seen it happen too many times in the past where a player with speed in this offense put up some big games in the fantasy playoffs after everybody else got hurt, to say, oh no, that's not going to happen with Abanikanda, or even with someone like Taylor, a player that, doesn't have as much pizzazz or, window appeal, but, could end up being the guy.
Shawn, I did get excited there for either Guerendo or Abanikanda as we enter this stretch when you mentioned the Mostert plays, because that felt like, you're saying about being gone. He, a couple of seasons ago with the 49ers, when he took that big step forward, he was just gone as well. So we'll see if they can scheme.
Did he have a decent game against your Green Bay Packers?
Yeah. I wasn't. I started with a joyous picture in my head, Shawn. I had blanked out the color of the uniforms, but thanks for that. Are you going to start talking about Colin Kaepernick running all over the Packers next to add to the hurt in 49ers uniforms? But Shawn, we will move on swiftly. A couple of other notes maybe to look at and maybe there's not much to talk about here, but the Kansas City Chiefs backfield, obviously we have Kareem Hunt there, we have Pacheco now active, we have Samaje Perine, we have Carson Steele. This backfield was kind of split three ways really last week, with Carson Steele really missing out. He just had 4% of the snaps. But what's your thoughts on this particular backfield as we move forward? Or is it just going to be a case where it's going to be muddy the rest of the way? Or do you expect Pacheco to take over here?
I think it'll be Pacheco. One of the things that Ben mentioned and kind of broke down on Stealing Bananas is how pass heavy the Chiefs were in this game. I noted in the universe that it was odd that suddenly you have a second guy and someone like Pacheco where you get that 34-yard run and you're like, oh, thank goodness. I mean, Pacheco is a below average NFL running back, but at least if there's a hole and like no one over there, he can run to daylight a little bit.
He looks a lot above the rest of these guys when you're talking about, above average. Some of these Chiefs running backs, Shawn, are a long way below average.
Well, in discussing the decline of Alvin Kamara, I was noting that since the beginning of week 3, he's at minus 28 fantasy points over expected. And a lot of that has come in the receiving game, which is very important for Kamara because that's where he scores his points. That's what makes him different. That's what gives him an elite EP workload. Colm, as we head into week 14, Colm, in the midst of this robust running back season, this
RB
revenge
renaissance
season, the RB renaissance, all of those things within a season where we're getting so much running back scoring, the workloads are not necessarily that big. We have Kamara and Mixon above 19 EP, but not at 20. We don't have a back at 20. We only have 4 other starters above 16. That's Barkley, Walker, Kyren Williams, Bijan Robinson. If you have Walker and Williams, you might even be in situations we talked about, early in the show. Would you consider playing some of these really fringe players? Probably not, right? You're still going to have better flex options, but you could be in the reverse where you're looking at Kenneth Walker or Kyren Williams in your starting lineup and thinking, maybe I could go a different direction there. I was checking in the weekly game level similarity projections, and we do have guys like Chase Brown and Tyrone Tracy that the app is very enthusiastic about compared to some of these other players. But again, Barkley, Walker, Williams, and Bijan, they're the only other 4 above 16, and none of them are at 17, right? So we have these tiers that are much lower than you would expect. Now, you have guys like Barkley and Henry and James Cook who are putting up some massive numbers in fantasy points over expected. We're having a huge touchdown season for a lot of these big names. So we're getting plenty of running back scoring, but certainly Kamara is the guy who has the full workload profile. Unfortunately, the concerns we had coming into the season are now really manifesting in that he's simply not playing well. Right? But the way that ties back into the Kansas City Chiefs, only Kareem Hunt has more negative FPOE. Kareem Hunt has destroyed 35 potential fantasy points by simply not living up to expectation. Now, some of that's going to be fluky. Some of it can be elements of game context that, for whatever reason, don't directly fit with the way that those numbers are calculated. But Colm, being at negative 35 is certainly not good. The flip side of that is that someone who has fantastic peripherals, right? A Kenneth Walker also is on a really, really bad stretch in terms of fantasy points over expected. I think anytime that the numbers don't line up and you have someone who is putting up the peripherals but not getting the fantasy points, you're going to be a lot more enthusiastic about a bounce back. There is some danger to benching Kenneth Walker. I guess in my mind, the tricky part is that if you watch the Seahawks play, you could easily envision a scenario where all of the expected points dry up as well, and they just decide to throw a pass every single time. They simply cannot run the ball. What do you think we're going to get with, first of all, this Kansas City Chiefs team now that Isiah Pacheco is back?
I think they should go with Pacheco as the lead back. Now, will that happen? I'm not quite sure. They're mixing in, obviously, as we mentioned here, 4 different running backs. I also think there's part of this, Shawn, when we look at last week, and obviously you want to win the game and you want to win every game, and the Chiefs are going for the number 1 seed. But I think there might be part of it with Pacheco as well, that like if they can keep him ticking over now and get him back to 100% health, we're looking at a player who was active last week and was in the game, but that doesn't necessarily mean he's all the way back. And they might be looking ahead to that playoff picture as well as they, work their way into it from that perspective. So maybe the team were doing some situational management there, even though, it was a little bit trickier than they probably would have wanted. But I think that he comes out probably in week 14 when we're having this conversation next week. He's the person who's the clear running back. He's the best running back on the roster currently. You mentioned Kenneth Walker as well. It's been tough for Walker all season. We were kind of highlighting at the start of the year some of the tremendous plays that he was having, where he was kind of almost trying to do what Bucky Irving's doing now, where he's having to run laterally across the field to be able to make some of these runs happen. But there's been a lot of challenges on that run game, and it hasn't been very productive. And over the last number of weeks, he's really struggled to get much going. And then last week, obviously, we get the touchdown going the way of Charbonnet, and that makes it a little bit more challenging for him. So I'm sure there's people that are having those kind of conversations if they have a strong additional option to put into the backfield in their lineup with the likes of Walker as we move here into the playoff picture. You mentioned Alvin Kamara. Kendre Miller seems to be an actual NFL player who is potentially going to be available to play on the NFL now that we have a coaching change. He's out of the doghouse. He's ready to go. Is there a shot here that we see some shifting of the usage in the backfield as we get in here towards the end of the season? Maybe they want to see what they have in the younger player. Obviously, they've extended Kamara, so that keeping him healthy maybe ahead of next season as well. But we do also have Taysom Hill out for the rest of the season. He was somebody who was getting some of those touches in the passing game, maybe that would have went the way of Alvin Kamara, but also maybe some of the goal line work and things like that. But that also opens up the door for the likes of Kendre Miller here as we move into these coming weeks to gain some of those opportunities that if we had a healthy Taysom Hill and a performing Alvin Kamara, that just probably wouldn't be there. What's your outlook on him as we go forward here? Is there still hope? Let's take another trip down memory lane, Shawn. Is this where we see like the Devin Singletary style late season come to fruition breakout? Is there a chance for Kendre Miller here?
There's always a chance, right? The situation with Miller reminds me a lot of the early career situation with Deontay Foreman, who also had a significant injury in there. But Colm Foreman is a player who came into the league with, some red flags in his prospect profile, but the actual size production, the size, speed, collegiate production numbers were fantastic, to where he looked like one of these guys who was going to be a great value for tuned in fantasy managers, when it turned out to be a little bit the opposite, where NFL teams knew that there were some character issues that were going to make it difficult for him to thrive. And that's what happened. It requires a second team. You have to have some patience. An NFL franchise at a certain point that is more desperate for running back play and is more willing to live with the lack of professionalism, or in some of these cases, Colin, I think we all have experiences either in sports or in our normal work lives where you do have someone on your team or in your office who is pretty talented, and maybe as a result of that, or maybe just purely separately, they also don't have great consistency or a great work ethic. Maybe they're hard to get along with and cause problems, whatever those issues are. And in many cases, it's not a matter of can they suddenly become a normal part of the team? It's a question of, can they reduce how bad the problems are, right? If you go from being a complete headache, never prepared, won't do anything correctly, to just kind of lazy and unprepared, sometimes that can be enough of a step if you're talented enough to get the job done. I think that's kind of where we are with Kendre Miller right now. I think that he's probably burned enough bridges with the Saints that he's more likely to have, if he does succeed at all. And again, it comes back to the fact that he's very talented, and that's always going to be in demand, right? Probably will be with a different team, but the Saints have to be sure that he's not ever going to do something for them before they kind of move on and let him go. When you think about a situation with Leonard Fournette as well. Now, Fournette was actually wildly productive. Wild is probably an exaggeration, but someone who was drafted really early. The team did get some value out of him. Even though they'd gotten some value out of him, they finally were like, we would just prefer to have you not on the team, which is basically what's happened with one of our favorites, Stephon Diggs, at several places as well. So, I mean, that kind of thing does happen. The situation that Kendre Miller is in is, even to get like up to the level where your employer is willing to live with some of it, you have to actually do something. You have to be available to make some plays. The Saints are definitely one of the teams where the last month of the season for them is going to be evaluation. Even in those cases, you don't simply throw out guys who won't do anything that you're asking. It sends a terrible message to the rest of your players who are working their tails off to make sure they get a chance for evaluation. You can't simply let someone jump the line if they won't do any of the things or live by any of the sort of core ethic that you have built into your franchise. So we'll see. I'm hopeful, but also very skeptical at this point.
Didn't sound very hopeful, Shawn. She went through it. The other name when I mentioned Devin Singletary I was trying to think of was Rashad Penny. For longtime listeners, they'll remember that they were the two that really supercharged one of our FFPC Best Ball Tournament team, Shawn, to a second place finish. We always mention that Conor O'Driscoll did pep us to the post in that one, but those two guys down the stretch, that was the 2021 season, I think, if I can remember. But there hadn't been much production from Penny. He'd struggled to get in healthy for a long time. He kind of had a career run over the course of 6 games. But Shawn, that is going to get us to the end of the show as we get ready for week 14. Hopefully people have enjoyed listening in. Hopefully there's some interesting running back information there to take away from it. If you are signing up over at RotoViz, you can use the code RVRadio2024 at checkout to get yourself a 10% discount off a RotoViz NFL pass. Shawn, the 3-month offer still rolling here as we approach the holiday period.
Yeah, get your Christmas presents now.
Get those
folks love to read about fantasy football. I mean, you probably have 4 or 5 family members across your extended family. Probably a couple of uncles, a cousin, a brother-in-law, a grandfather who's hard to shop for.
Shawn's like, Colm, you've a newborn. Does he want one?
I don't know that Colm's newborn wants one. My nephews are still very young. They're probably not the target audience. Everybody else, Colm.
Everybody else.
They want a fantasy football subscription.
Yeah, you can get those over at rotoviz.com if you are subscribing up. But maybe you're already subscribed. You're going to renew 10% off with the code RVRadio2024. That is where we're going to close this one out. Good luck in week 14. Hopefully the Packers have got a win on Thursday Night Football. And until we are back, have a good one.